Part 13. The Military Containment Field. All is War. The Trading with the Enemy Act, Military Occupation, and Emergency War Powers. It is important to frame all of this discussion into the legal context to understand how the great American dream of sovereign standing and free people was inverted into the American nightmare of perpetual bondage and eternal debt containment. This, of course, is a vast subject requiring significant study, but there are essential building blocks that can be briefly discussed. It all distills down to the mechanics by which a free people were converted to voluntary servants and enemies of the state. Following the Civil War and the abolishment of involuntary servitude, slavery, the process can be seen in its simple equation as transposing involuntary servitude into voluntary servitude. This involved the passage, enactment, and implementation of various building blocks from the Civil War into the 1930s and beyond. The primary building blocks are 1. The Lieber Code, issued under the authority of martial law Commander-in-Chief Abraham Lincoln on April 24, 1863, that established the Manual for Rules of War and Military Occupation for the United States. This later became the foundational template for international treaties for the same purpose on a global scale. And 2. The creation of the civil body, under federal control and jurisdiction, through the Civil Rights Acts of 1866, 1870, 1871, and 1875. And 3. The 14th Article of Amendment that defined a U.S. citizen as a person born into or naturalized into the United States and subject to the jurisdiction thereto. The amendment also established the inviolate and uncontestable nature of the debt of the United States, including, quote, pensions and bounty for services in the suppression of insurrection and rebellion, end quote, against the United States, thus tying together the two components of U.S. citizenship and perpetual debt. And 4. The Reconstruction Acts of 1867 and 68, establishing military districts occupying the defeated southern states. Military districts were later extended throughout the United States by extending its jurisdiction into 10 districts that correspond to the 10 zip code areas, where ZIP is actually an acronym for Zone Improvement Plan, where the postal zones are fictional overlay territories in the federal zone created to be military districts. This is known as the territorial jurisdiction of the United States. And 5. The incorporation of a United States corporation in the Washington District of Columbia on February 21, 1871, thus establishing a municipal corporation, with additional related acts pertaining to the District of Columbia passed on June 20, 1874, and June 11, 1878. This is known as the municipal jurisdiction of the United States. And 6. The international treaties for rules of war on land in 1899 and 1907. And 7. The Trading with the Enemy Act, TWEA, of October 6, 1917, that specifically excluded U.S. citizens' persons from the definition of an enemy. And 8. The Emergency Banking Relief Act, EBRA, of March 9, 1933, that amended the TWEA to now include all persons within the United States and subject to the jurisdiction thereof. This gave the executive complete unilateral control to do whatever was required to protect the monetary system of the United States. And 9. Executive Proclamations 2039 and 2040, pursuant to and confirmed by the EBRA, that established a temporary emergency and then an open-ended and still operational extension, bankruptcy of the United States Corporation and all subdivisions thereof, individual franchises, and all other corporations. This short list provides the primary building blocks of the integrated military occupation and corporate bonding systems in Admiralty pursuant to rules of international bankruptcy. To fully explicate these subjects would take significant volumes beyond the scope of this document. Be that as it may, they are essential components of this comprehensive overview that must be understood and integrated in the overall story. We will only synthesize them into the key and salient points, which is simply the creation of the containment field discussed in this paper. The essence of this context is the creation of a military occupation that posits all persons within the United States and subject to the jurisdiction thereof as enemies of the state. And this, in fact, extends to all persons on the planet who are bonded to any central bank of issue in the many national corporations that have used Federal Reserve notes as their primary reserve currency. This requirement was firmly established by the Bretton Woods Agreement in 1944 that established the U.S. dollar Federal Reserve note as the sole reserve currency in the world. Keep in mind that the word person is the same as the decedent estate or franchise referred to throughout this discussion. It is the artificial juristic person with juridical characteristics. Only juristic persons with juridical characteristics are within and subject to the jurisdiction of the United States, not living men, women, and children. The only thing that technically belongs to the United States is the property it creates or has vested to it. And that property is the commercial paper that attaches to the person and overlays the living by the bonded surety relationship. That includes its title to property, but not the property itself. As to the above 9 points, these, as an integrated whole, established military districts run and controlled pursuant to national and international rules and customs of war. This includes the requirements of the use and management of the people and property of the occupied territories. This constitutes what is called usufruct, which is the civil procedure controlling the use of the property or fruits of labor belonging to another. Usufruct is a right of enjoyment, enabling a holder to derive profit or benefit from property that is either titled to another person or which is held in common ownership, as long as the property is not damaged or destroyed. In the world system, the people are given limited beneficial use, usufruct, of the property they use every day in the realm of commerce. Their rights of use are held as the cestui trust, the beneficiary, that enables them to use the property that belongs to another party, the state. But this relationship is turned around when we regain our status as the true living beneficiaries, the cestui. In that relationship, the usufruct use of the property is vested in the state, and in that position they must follow their international treaties and be the usufructory trustee, with the real benefit and beneficial rights of ownership reverting back to the people. This is clearly stated in Article 55 of the Treaty at the Hague Convention of 1907 as follows. The occupying state shall be regarded only as administrator and usufructory of public buildings, real estate, forests, and agricultural estates belonging to the hostile state and situated in the occupied country. It must safeguard the capital of these properties and administer them in accordance with the rules of usufruct. In the first instance of the people being the cestui trust with limited use of the property belonging to the state, the overlaid commercial paper, and with the status of bonded surety, use can only be done by license. By definition, A license is issued as the means to do something by permission that is illegal but is allowed to be done by licensed variants. This is why everything is coded and requires permits, licenses, and the rest of the system of domination, limitation, and control. In effect, the only two things that are illegal are commerce and usury, creation of commercial securities and the use of public property. The rest are codified rules for the control and penalties involved in the infractions or felonies for overstepping the rules of use and the rules of war within the field of battle of commerce. On that field, we are the enemies of a foreign state, United States, as military occupier, and any use of commercial paper and property contrary to the codified rules is considered to be an act of insurrection and rebellion, i.e., domestic or paper terrorism. Here is a modern example to make it perfectly clear how and why the United States is a foreign state that declared war on the people and territory of the Union and now control it by military occupation. Most people understand that the territory known as Hong Kong was a lease given by the Chinese to the British for 99 years that expired in 1997. The territory that was occupied through peaceful contract or lease was sovereign territory of the British for that leasehold period, but at the end of that period it reverted back to the Chinese sovereign control. The two sovereign states were distinctly and separate during the leasehold period. For residents or citizens of either territory to cross the border into the other territory required visas and other legal requirements. So imagine if Britain decided to cross over the border with an army into sovereign Chinese territory and proceeded to occupy the entire country. If that were the case, the British would become the invader and eventually military occupier. As such, it would make rules and regulations by which the Chinese citizens would be managed in a civil system. Under the rules of usufruct, the British would have to maintain the capital value of the occupied territory, buildings, farms, factories, etc. But of course, the Chinese would take up arms to fend off the invasion, and those doing so would be considered belligerents. If the British succeeded in the military takeover, the citizens of China would be disarmed, and if they took up arms again, they would be considered rebels and insurgents. British officers and field soldiers would receive pensions and bounty for their services in suppressing such rebellions undertaken by enemy combatants. Now imagine that the same thing applies to the entity known as United States of America that is a crown possession as evidenced by the references in the Treaty of Paris of 1783. The United States and Congress assembled entered into a type of leasehold contract that awarded the United States of America the right to occupy a 10-square-mile district, later named District of Columbia, to situate itself within so that it could perform its duties as a government services contractor. A bicameral body, a body with two chambers known as the Senate and House of Representatives, known as Congress, was part of that agreement to represent the interests of the states and the people, respectively, the high contracting parties of the agreement. Then, just as in our imaginary example where the British invaded China against the agreement, the United States of America and the United States, fused together and known as the United States acting by Municipal Corporation Charter per the Act of 1871, invaded the Union of States, the sovereign territory of the people and their states. This is exactly what happened, but whereas the Chinese would not have taken too kindly to the invasion by the British, the people of the several states simply sat back and let it happen. In this writer's experience over the last 20 years, during which successive layers of the commercial system were thoroughly researched and directly applied to situations, The key in all of it was using the tenets of the Uniform Commercial Code through a non-judicial administrative process to perfect a full commercial default, and thereby to enter a default judgment onto the record via what is called a notarial protest. Under the UCC, an administrative process is started in all cases by an offer to contract. Thus, everything ever issued in the name, tax bills, court complaints and summons, judgment orders, traffic citations, are all offers to contract. In commerce, staying in honor is paramount, and the only way to stay in honor is to respond. If one does not respond, then the mechanisms of the UCC kick in, and a straight-out rejection or remaining in silence is considered a dishonor. The one in honor always wins, while the one in dishonor always loses. This is why the participants in a court case are encouraged, by intimidation, not by force, to refer to the judge or magistrate as Your Honor. The secondary and unspoken part of that equation is my dishonor. This alone gives the position of being in honor to that party who represents the interest of the commercial court, and thus the court always wins, and the judge has the ultimate prerogative of who loses, which is usually the defendant who has tacitly admitted their dishonor. As discussed above, in the commercial administrative processes used by many people over the years, a document is prepared that is an offer to contract. It contains statements and facts that are known that the public officials cannot respond to, thus silence becomes acceptance. Then it's a simple matter of 2 more steps to establish complete default. These presentments are sent under a notary seal so that the notary involved can place into the record the respondent's lack of response. In this type of process, the notary's powers include the ability to declare a lack of response, and the notary has the power to enter a default judgment. This creates a default judgment, and the notary can then issue a notary protest. This protest perfects a commercial lien for lack of performance, and with this, the party presenting can place a commercial lien on the respondents. But the problem is that lien now becomes a monetary instrument as a perfected claim, and guess what? We should know by now in this discussion the answer to that question. The answer is that that party cannot state a claim because he or she is a bankrupt. As such, the act of doing this type of commercial process and filing publicly recorded commercial liens becomes an act of war done by an enemy combatant, worthy of suppression for insurrection and rebellion. Once a person or persons does such a thing, this kicks in the 4th section of the 14th Amendment, which states the inviolate basis of the federal debt and provides the same for bounties of service in the suppression of insurrection and rebellion. Since the population is given the privilege of licensed use of the commercial arena, any act contrary to the 100 million codes that control that field is considered an act of insurrection and rebellion. Therefore, the judges, officers, prosecutors, and others have the full right to suppress those acts by any means available to them, hence fines and imprisonment. There are no exceptions, no matter how much someone or some group wants to stand up and shout foul or fraud or unconstitutional. This understanding is essential to knowing how to remove oneself from the field of battle. Once a man or woman removes himself or herself from the field of battle, goes to peace, and perfects private standing, he or she must be regarded by the system as the cestui que, the living beneficiary. When this is done, the tables are turned, and now the usufructuary trustee is the state, including all of its officers, agents, and actors, and they must follow the rules of usufruct, which are to the benefit of the people. If they do not, they are abrogating international treaty law. This is accomplished without protest, violence, polarity, or vengeance, and simply rearranges the relationship in the entire structure outlined in this paper. This leads to one primary question: which do you want to be? The Sestake Trust and bonded surety in perpetual debt, or the Sestake V as the living beneficiary, whereby the true owner is the beneficiary and the corporate actors are the civil servants bound and constrained by their own codes, holding all the liabilities and requiring the use of our equitable interests and life estates for the settlement of all claims and liabilities. In the above described administrative processes, most of the time the parties issuing the process would quote the maxims of commerce. These were understood to bind the parties in the public in commerce, as maxims are considered universally accepted foundations of law. The irony is, the one maxim that we thought really stuck it to them is the one that, in fact, hung us out to be at the mercy of the court or otherwise. That one states, "He who leaves the field of battle first loses." In this we thought that we were so right to issue an offer to contract, and by their lack of response or silence, we received their acquiescence or agreement to the terms of the contract, and their silence equated to them leaving the field of battle, and we won. They lost. What a galactic game of bait and switch. We won, and by winning the battle, we decidedly lost the war. What those without eyes to see did not see was the phrase field of battle, focusing instead on he who leaves first. When the lights go on, we can hear the sounds of uh-oh, or whoops, or oh boy, this is going to hurt. Right there we are being told in plain sight, but hidden from most who do not have eyes to see, that we are in a field of battle because all activity in the field of commerce equates to all is war. And in war, the entire world system is built and controlled. Therefore, just by the very act of the allowance of our living being to be attached as a bonded surety to the bankrupt franchise, to accept licenses, certificates, and registration on the franchise name, for which we continually act as the authorized representative and registered agent, we are explicitly and tacitly admitting we are the enemies of the state, and therefore within the United States and subject to the jurisdiction thereof. This is where the rubber meets the road. When we wish to understand the nature, character, and essence of bondage within a militarily occupied domestic zone under international rules of war and military occupation by treaty, as supported by emergency war powers and the Emergency Banking Relief Act. As the saying goes, war is a bitch, and alas, in our current reality, all is war. The only way to win is not to play the game. The only way to not play the game is to withdraw consent. The only way to withdraw consent is to timely and properly remove all attachments that support the ongoing presumption of consent. Otherwise, all actions taken within the system constitute recontracting and reaffirming consent over and over again. The phrase, "you shall know them by their acts and deeds," works both ways. Yes, good acts and deeds in the world are duly noted, but as well, if your acts are those of a debtor and bonded surety, then you will be known as such. The deeds that are issued as offers to contract that are left on the table are thereby abandoned and equally telling. They are the pseudo-representations of reality, the fictional deeds issued as commercial contracts that monetize the underlying estate to create public funds as monetized debt under public policy, and by these deeds, too, shall we be known. Each time a public actor or agent issues a commercial instrument in the name, there are equities created behind that instrument. If we do not accept the deed to perfect our claim of those equities, they are considered abandoned. Once abandoned, the equitable interests are claimed by the actors, agents, agencies, and departments of the corporate state under the rules of maritime salvage and claim. From there, they do what they do, and no protest or claim will suffice to change that. Conversely, if we are standing on the land with true status as a living being and engaging our natural capacity to create, we have standing as a self-directed being with sovereign free will. When we direct such capacity into real work in the world, our acts of creation, valor, and value manifestation shall be the deeds by which we are known. We must acknowledge and accept the offers as deeds holding previously unseen equitable value, and thus, pursuant to the maximum of equity, equity will not perfect an imperfect deed. We perfect such deeds and bring equity to our aid. The imperfect deed is the one that is abandoned and left on the table, which we as bonded sureties without standing do every single day. Ultimately, the most equitable value we can ever receive is the gift of life. The one question remaining is, are we here to give lip service to life, or are we going to integrate ourselves with our true equitable estate, the gift of life, and step forward boldly where very few have gone before, and start to build a world of truth, value, creation, and honoring all life?